So I mentioned the era of good feelings and James Monroe being resoundingly reelected in 1820 to the presidency. So right up through the election of 1824, there had been this 8-year period of the era of good feelings, from the end of the War of 1812 right up through the election of 1824. And in this time period, you have James Monroe issuing what he is most known for during his presidency, and that is the Monroe Doctrine. And this is kind of a weird thing because, as I mentioned, you have the era of good feelings, everything's going so well, he's especially popular, and his decree is quite popular actually as well, the Monroe Doctrine. But it's weird to understand the Monroe Doctrine because from our perspective, the policy of neutrality that had been proposed by George Washington sounded very peaceful, like we don't want conflict, and we only want positive trade relations with other European powers. And James Monroe's issuance of the Monroe Doctrine was actually a threat of violence. So one of his most popular moves is to threaten violence against European nations that try to recolonize in the Western Hemisphere. This is a very similar concept to mutually assured destruction during the Cold War, where the United States and Soviet Union, for example, we both had nuclear weapons and we threatened to use them on each other, which actually helped keep the peace. And that was Monroe's goal, and it did work very well for many generations, that the United States was trying to actually avoid conflict with European nations. We're actually trying to maintain our neutrality by this issuance of the Monroe Doctrine. So you have an attempt to keep the peace through threat of violence. So again, very similar to MAD during the Cold War. So this is a weird concept to wrap your brain around, but I hope it makes sense. There are many, many political cartoons that deal with the Monroe Doctrine. You can see here Uncle Sam very proudly declaring a separation between the United States and Europe on the other side of the Atlantic. You can see here, too, a wall built labeled Monroe Doctrine. And again, a very clear line between the United States and European powers. And there's even a European drummer boy, it appears, and he is thumbing his nose at these European powers. Here's another Monroe Doctrine line in the sand, shall we say. Uncle Sam telling these European powers, stay out of the Western Hemisphere. One of the things that allowed us to be so threatening with these European powers was our naval fleet that was being built up during this time period. So part of the reason we could threaten the European powers with violence and make them believe that we were capable of it was building up our naval fleet. And here's another, the United States declaring hands off the Western Hemisphere, stay away, here's the ocean separating us, stay over there. And one more, Americans represented here, protecting the Western Hemisphere from the threat of Europeans here, with that very clear defined divide. So I can almost guarantee that at some point you are going to need to address a political cartoon that deals with the Monroe Doctrine. So this was very brief. I stress mainly the political cartoons. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out. Ask those questions in class. And if you have no questions, I'll see you in class.